Hello there, good evening. You're watching the press preview. It's a first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. Well, it's time to see what's making the headlines. That's with the director of the Demos think tank, Mackenzie, and the Home Affairs editor at The Times, Matt Dathan. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's take a look at what is on some of those front pages. Well, The Times leads with a warning from the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, that Russia's using peace talks with Ukraine as a smokescreen, as she describes it, for war crimes. On The Telegraph, President Biden threatens China that there will be consequences if Beijing provided Russia with weapons to assist its invasion. And The Express claims an exclusive with the news of a royal offer for help of Ukrainian refugees coming to the UK. The Financial Times leads with the P&O ferry sackings and a comment by the Archbishop of Canterbury that the company's action was unethical. And The Guardian also has this story. The business secretary has warned the company of an unlimited fine if it was found to have broken the law. And The Mirror focuses on the cheaper agency workers that were brought in to replace the sacked staff under the headline P and Low Pay. On the front page of The Sun, the Queen plans to spend more time in her Scottish home. The headline, Monarch of the Glen. And another royal story, this one in the Daily Mail. The Cambridges have cancelled their first big engagement on their Caribbean tour in a row over Indigenous rights. While The Star looks forward to the weekend's warm weather with the headline, Hot, Hot, Hot. That sounds good, doesn't it? Certainly promising. Well, a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out those front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. Well, we're joined tonight by Mackenzie and the Home Affairs editor at The Times, Matt Dathan. Very good evening to both of you. Nice of you to join us here on Sky News on a Friday night. We're going to start, aren't we, with the front page of The Times and that photograph of Vladimir Putin there, Polly, at this bizarre spectacle, the rally that he held at that football stadium in Moscow.
It was bizarre. It sort of had a sort of worldwide wrestling federation kind of vibe to it. Lots of hype and cheering. And he stood on what looked like a wrestling arena or a sort of boxing arena right in the middle of the stadium and gave this speech in celebration of what they claim is a denazification process of Ukraine, liberating Russian speakers in Ukraine, of course, none of which has any basis in reality, but is the story that Russian leaders have been propagating through Russian state media for the last 8 years since that annexation of Crimea. It was, it's, I think, horrifying to see the way that ordinary Russians have been caught up in these lies which have been pushed on them by the state so relentlessly, and the power that has to shape the narrative. I think it's incredibly important that alternative media sources find ways where and however they can to get in to reach the Russian people and explain the lies that are being pushed on them by this leader.
Part of the story there, Matt, also says that a lot of the people who were in attendance at this rally are allegedly public sector employees who were coerced into going.
Yeah, that's right. It's obviously very hard to verify anything that Russia does at the moment. But the reports are around 200,000 people there, but many people who I think some reporters on the ground spoke to were public servants forced to go at the end of their shift or during their shift. I enjoyed this quote, one man who said that most people here don't support the war. I'll go for a bit, but then I'll head off. It did seem there was a very sort of mixed reaction from the crowd. Many people were seen leaving before it finished, and it's obviously very hard to verify what Russians really think. But I guess 200,000 out of a huge population Russia has. I mean, it's obviously a fraction of population, but how many people were there actually supporting Vladimir Putin? No one knows. And what I found, it's quite sickening, really. The music that was played, one was headlined, made in the USSR, made in the USSR, with the opening line, Ukraine and Crimea, Belarus and Moldova, it's all my country. So I think maybe it's Vladimir Putin trying to rally his own country in the knowledge that the war is, that he is sort of, his grip on the war is slipping, and he realizes that there are factions of his own population who are starting to protest. Obviously, we saw the TV protest last week, and maybe he's just trying to sort of show his own country, his own population, that he is still in control.
Interesting as well, Polly, that it says in the article, Liz Truss saying that the sanctions on Russian oligarchs are likely to be permanent.
Well, I mean, what does permanent mean in this context? I mean, I think what we would hope is that Russia can return to the family of nations by potentially changing its leader, or most importantly, changing its approach. In a way, it feels the way that the oligarchs acquired that wealth is through the kind of complete messed up voucher privatization as at the end of the USSR, and then the way that kind of kleptocratic systems were set up to funnel power and wealth to those few individuals. Nevertheless, I don't think what we want is for us to be in a permanent state of kind of a cold economic conflict with Russia, of wanting to keep Russian businessmen and Russian products out of Europe, out of flowing into the rest of the world. But I think what Liz Truss is suggesting is that it's very hard to imagine a pathway back to being able to trust and reintegrate Russia when, as she says, Vladimir Putin is just creating the illusion of these peace talks whilst continuing to relentlessly bomb, almost obliterate certain towns in Ukraine, with no kind of sense that actually what they're looking for is peace, and it's therefore very hard to trust them.
Matt, let's turn to the front page of the Daily Telegraph. And of course, the big power broker here, China. We know that President Biden was speaking to President Xi Jinping earlier today. Where do we think this is going?
I think at the moment the Western countries are really trying to work out where China sits really in this whole power play, and I think the next few days are going to be crucial to see how China really responds to the war. And the Telegraph reports, as does other papers, that China is trying to work out itself. China is a country inherently reluctant to sort of comment or interfere with other nations' affairs, at least publicly, from its politicians. And obviously, its actions speak for something else. But Biden today, in his call, was reported to have warned that there'll be implications and consequences of if China does back Russia's war and aids it with military equipment and helps it dodge or circumvent economic sanctions. What these implications and consequences are, is yet to obviously seen. But if the West starts hitting China with the same ferocity of economic sanctions as it did with Russia, I think then that just hits a completely new level of economic impact for the whole world. And I think that Xi Jinping warned that this would have far-reaching consequences for the West as well. And he was quoted as telling Biden that he who tied the bell to the tiger must take it off. And I think that's quite a worrying and dangerous kind of quote there, that the war of words is now starting to sound between the world's two biggest powers.
Yeah, and Polly, many people saying that actually China's really interested to see how all of this is going to play out, and concerns about perhaps what China's intentions might be towards the likes of Taiwan, for example.
Yeah, I think it is fascinating to watch China. At the Olympic Games, there was this, sort of staged event between President Xi and President Putin, sort of coming together to talk about an alliance, to talk about the risks of NATO. Made a real play out of being united together, and I think sent sort of shivers of worry across that NATO alliance. Then when Russia took this extraordinary step of just invading Ukraine, China didn't immediately back them, even though, as you say, they have some sympathy for the sort of the ethno-nationalist Russian narrative that Ukraine really belongs to them, because there are some similarities to the sense that there is a greater China, which includes Taiwan and Tibet, places that they believe belong to them and ought to be kind of fully incorporated into the Chinese nation. Nevertheless, they are still kind of keeping their powder dry. That quote Matt used about it's sort of classic Chinese proverb, isn't it? About the bell on the tiger, is that sense that this escalation has happened partly because of NATO, partly because of, the warmth with which NATO expressed its openness to Ukraine, and that sense which Russia has absolutely pushed that it has a legitimate sphere of influence, a kind of colonialist approach really to countries around it that ought to just listen to it and not face West. And that therefore it is in the end the West's fault for having aggravated Putin. I think that's an extremely damaging and dangerous narrative for any of us to fall into, in that, international relations are complicated, but invading a country is simply illegal and wrong.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I just want to bring us on before we go to the break, Matt. The other story that's on a few of the front pages, of course, perfect textbook example of dreadful corporate PR, isn't it? The behaviour of P&O towards its workers.
Yeah, and if it wasn't obviously for the war in Ukraine, I think this would be on the front of all papers tomorrow. It's quite a shocking situation. 800 staff sacked within just 30 minutes' notice on a pre-recorded Zoom call. And now the government is obviously facing a lot of pressure to intervene. And we hear tonight that the business secretary has written warning of criminal sanctions against the bosses. And this now we've hit economic sanctions against so many individuals in Russia. Obviously, that's now raises it leads people to call for the same kind of sanctions against these kind of bosses who have just sacked so many staff on the spot. And you can see the trouble the government is going to get itself in if it does start pursuing that line of the campaigners are calling for.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more of that story next week, aren't we? Matt, Dathan, Polly, Mackenzie, thank you very much indeed.